In this podcast episode, host Tucker Carlson speaks with Ari Flanzraich, who has lived in Israel for about 10 years, to delve into the complex dynamics surrounding the events of October 7th, 2023, the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and broader Middle Eastern geopolitics. The discussion covers the build-up to the attack led by Hamas, Israeli internal politics, the settler movement in the West Bank, the controversial funding of Hamas, and reflections on Israel's demographic, cultural, and strategic challenges. Ari explains that to truly understand the significance of October 7th, one must look beyond the immediate framework of the attack and examine a broader timeline, especially tracing the trajectory of Hamas since 2007. The event cannot simply be dismissed as a random act of anti-Semitism or reactive violence post-attack. The inflammatory incidents of 2021, including clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Sheikh Jarrah evictions, created internal tensions within Israel's Arab-Jewish society and awakened militant activity in the West Bank. Hamas, since taking over Gaza in 2007 by ousting the Palestinian Authority, initially positioned itself as a resistance movement refusing to negotiate with Israel and aiming to reclaim Palestinian exile lands. However, following a violent conflict in 2014, a period of tense silence ensued, which proved unsustainable. By 2018, Hamas's leader, Yahya Sinwar, appeared to recognize that maintaining a static and repressive status quo was detrimental to their cause, hinting at the inevitability of another, more devastating conflict. The conceptual planning of October 7th likely began around October 2022, with renewed regional alliances between Hamas, Syria, and Iran, marking a build-up to this turning point. The conversation touches on accusations that the Israeli government, under Prime Minister Netanyahu, indirectly funded Hamas through intermediaries such as Qatar and the United States. This controversial tactic aimed to keep them fat and happy to preserve a fragile status quo and minimize attacks on Israel. Ari confirms the existence of documented transfers of suitcases filled with cash to Gaza, which was part of a payment strategy to maintain calm on the border. However, this strategy backfired as it inadvertently empowered Hamas without sufficiently restraining their ambitions. While the funds were intended to buy short-term peace, Hamas grew complacent and emboldened, contributing to the eventual scale and surprise of the October 7th attacks. This approach exemplifies the paradoxical and often transactional nature of Israeli-Palestinian interactions, where maintenance of peace sometimes requires supporting adversaries. Discussing the intelligence and military failures surrounding the October 7th attack, Ari expresses skepticism that the Israeli leadership genuinely allowed the breach to happen, but acknowledges that the response was undeniably inadequate. Multiple intelligence warnings, including a notable report called Jericho Wall, were purportedly dismissed by higher officials. Indicators like military drills, speeches, and unusual activity were reportedly observed, but not taken seriously enough. There was confusion regarding a so-called stand-down order during the attack, with frontline troops lacking basic equipment and drones or fighter jets not being deployed promptly. Ari emphasizes the logistical challenges of mobilizing forces quickly, especially during a Jewish holiday, but criticizes the lack of rapid aerial support. The intelligence failure symbolizes deep systemic problems within Israeli security structures and reveals vulnerabilities in what is often portrayed as an impeccable defense apparatus. Yahya Sinwar's rhetoric and actions suggest that Hamas viewed their resistance not just as sporadic violence, but as a strategic campaign designed to fundamentally disrupt the status quo established after 2014's long silence. Sinwar foresaw a conflict that would burn the green and the dry, a metaphor for devastating consequences affecting the entire region and political landscape. Ari proposes that Hamas's October 7th attack functions as a pivot akin to 9/11 for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, resetting the parameters of engagement and dragging Israel into prolonged, unpredictable conflicts. This is seen as a bloodbath that forcibly interrupts complacency and exposes Israel to regional instability. Sinwar apparently anticipated that Israel would be cornered into choosing either complete destruction of Gaza or a costly occupation, both of which entail long-term complications. After the war, rebuilding Gaza presents a complex challenge intertwined with legal, social, and geopolitical considerations. Ari shares insight from sources discussing an American-led effort involving legal experts to rethink Gaza's property and urban landscape by temporarily suspending private property rights and restructuring neighborhoods. This population rotation concept would fundamentally alter Gaza's demographic configuration, weakening long-standing property claims and potentially erasing historical precedents. The reconfiguration could last for years, possibly 7, creating a reset of land ownership that some view with deep cynicism. This notion raises questions about whether such drastic measures would facilitate rebuilding or become another tool in Israel's control over the territory. Ari goes in-depth into the settler phenomenon in the West Bank, particularly the emergence of the hilltop youth, a radicalized, often young settler demographic that blends nationalist fervor with cultural appropriation of Palestinian symbols, such as the keffiyeh. He describes settlers who engage in violent attacks against Palestinians, including arson, destruction of olive groves, and intimidation, sometimes beyond ideological motivations, venturing into what he calls an autoimmune aggression against their own state's interests. The settlers' desire to reclaim ancestral nativity and cement territorial claims fuels increasingly erratic and dangerous actions. Israeli authorities are depicted as inconsistent in responding to settler violence, sometimes complicit through inaction. Ari argues that these settlers pose an internal security threat, as their militancy could destabilize Israel from within. Reflecting on Israeli political dynamics, Ari contends that the left wing in Israel is essentially dead, crippled by its persistent reliance on the Oslo Accords and failure to evolve alternative strategies after repeated political and military disappointments. Meanwhile, the Israeli right has consolidated power by articulating concrete policies around settlements and judicial reforms. The Israeli right's dominance, particularly under Netanyahu, has marginalized more liberal or peace-oriented voices. This polarization reinforces hardline attitudes and reduces prospects for political compromise, contributing to escalating tensions both internally and with Palestinians. Ari discusses how Israelis perceive themselves as globally hated, which shapes a defensive and sometimes insular national psyche. Many Israelis feel that international criticism, especially relating to Gaza and Palestinian rights, is inherently anti-Semitic, though there is recognition of genuine anti-Semitism that exists worldwide. He notes that Israelis often feel misunderstood and expect others to intuitively grasp Israel's security concerns. This expectation breeds frustration and a cycle of mistrust. Internally, some Israelis wrestle with the recognition that their policies contribute to their international image, but there is limited public willingness to adjust course. The conversation touches on the ongoing religious versus secular divide in Israeli society. Ari notes that tensions between these groups remain relatively stable but could escalate. Additionally, the settler movement itself exhibits a complex mixture of religious conviction, nationalist aspiration, and cultural identity. He illustrates this with examples of settlers engaging in millenarian or messianic symbolism, as seen in expressions like Israelite fashion and the adoption of Palestinian attire, underscoring the psychological and ideological stakes of territorial claims. Ari suggests that Netanyahu's political strategy is deeply entwined with managing multiple regional conflicts simultaneously, effectively employing musical wars as a means of maintaining political power. This includes calibrated engagements in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran proxies. He argues that Netanyahu personally benefits from keeping the region in chaos, aligning his personal ambitions with state interests in a symbiotic way. Ari doubts any comprehensive or long-term plan exists for Gaza beyond tactical goals and highlights Netanyahu's reliance on instrumentalizing unresolved conflicts to shore up domestic support. Looking ahead, Ari believes Netanyahu is likely to remain in power, aided by a cycle of ongoing conflict that consolidates his support base. He foresees unresolved tensions in Lebanon and Iran persisting, shaped by a strategic balance that favors indefinite uncertainty rather than decisive resolution. The possibility of civil unrest or another significant upheaval in the West Bank is suggested, although it would differ in nature from the Gaza conflict. Ari describes an Israeli society grappling with internal contradictions and demographic challenges that provide both existential and psychological pressure points. Ari portrays Israeli attitudes toward the United States as a mix of affection, frustration, and condescension. Israelis are grateful for American financial and military support, but chafe at perceived naive interference or moralizing from U.S. policymakers. Trump, in particular, is admired in Israel for his take-the-gloves-off approach compared to the more cautious Biden administration. Regarding Gulf states, Ari notes Israelis generally hold positive views about countries like the UAE, which enjoy close ties with Israel, but expresses skepticism about deeper political compatibility given cultural differences. Qatar is viewed with ambivalence, seen mostly as a conduit for Hamas financial support rather than a political partner. Ari remarks on the efficacy of Israeli intelligence agencies, particularly Mossad, in infiltrating hostile countries such as Iran, Syria, and Lebanon. He finds it remarkable that Israel possesses such extensive networks of agents and informants in these adversarial states, attributing this success to human vulnerabilities and Israel's long-standing commitment to covert operations. This intelligence reach is one of the pillars of Israeli security strategy, though Ari cynically contrasts it with perceived American intelligence shortcomings in the same regions. Finally, the discussion touches briefly on the notion of rebuilding the Third Temple, a topic occasionally advocated by religious nationalists in Israel but not embraced as a state policy. While the idea enjoys some underground support and has cultural resonance, there are no active institutional efforts towards such a project. Ari notes the rise of messianic symbols in popular Israeli culture and military iconography, but characterizes these developments as a minority phenomenon with limited practical policy implications.